Ulrich asked me to talk about urban design and Asian megacities within this urban thing, and I thought it's quite problematic to stand in front of a group of people and speak to them about something they know more about than you do. So I've had to kind of massage this talk a little into an area with which I'm familiar and which I've done quite a lot of work through my own PhD and work since, about how people relate to objects and things and the spaces they live in and the cities in which they live. And really how I've discovered as I've become older, that there's actually quite a strong rearguard, almost anti-designed guerrilla action in society. And I've come to learn how designers really speak to each other quite a lot about design. But there's a whole bunch of people out there, probably 85–90% of the world, who don't listen and don't care and aren't particularly interested in the kind of design conversation that we as designers have in our working lives, because there is a danger, of course, that we talk to ourselves about things that we know and believe in. So I've done more work in recent years in trying to understand, how do we see things? How do we understand things? And how does the conversation we have as designers, particularly in design schools, about what constitutes good design, and the conversation we have about aesthetics, what does that actually mean? How do our brains work? How do we choose things? How do we relate to things? And I've done quite a bit of work in learning how we relate to things almost from a cultural tribal sense, from our own memory, from our childhood memories, from the memories that we gather in our parents' houses, and how that is very, very solid memory base. And our design education doesn't do a great deal to change that, actually. As well as that, I've lived in a number of different cities in the world and tried to get an understanding of what the word city means to people who live in these cities, and how we often think of cities within a very Western paradigm, and we don't often think about how different cultures think about cities in different ways. And that, of course, is part of the inheritance we have from the great international style, from the Bauhaus and onwards, and particularly in this area around here, which is still basking in the glowing ripples of the Ulm school. There is sometimes a lack of understanding how the rest of the world may think a different way. And we're prone to assume that concepts such as city and society and community mean the same thing in every part of the world, and they don't, of course. They mean different things in parts of the world. And we're challenged to think, what are some of the responses that people make to living in a city, to living in a space, to creating their own personal space? Because that's what we all do in our workplace and in our homes. We create a reflection of ourselves. We create a safe space for ourselves and protect ourselves from the world, often in that safe space. And is that design or is it not design? In the most broad way of thinking about design, which is anything that is human-made or human-influenced, of course it is, and then therefore everything is. And we probably have to step back and stop thinking of design as style or as a category of human creation, but understand that everything is part of that. Recently I was reading a very interesting book called The Island at the Center of the World, and it's a history of the development of New York in its first iteration as New Amsterdam. And the person who wrote this book, and I think he wrote this book so that I could read it just before coming up here to make this talk, fortunately, said two quotes I want to read to you. The Dutch at the beginning of the 17th century were amongst the first to separate their homes into public areas downstairs and private living space upstairs. It was the Dutch of this era who invented the idea of the home as a personal, intimate space. One might say they invented coziness or Gemütlichkeit. And the other quote from the book is that as the Dutch emigrated to their New World colony, they brought with them not only a ready mix of cultures, but a tolerance of differences, the prescription for a multicultural society. In its very seeding, Manhattan was a melting pot. So this, along then with also the Dutch leadership in commerce at the time, where Dutch society was based on an idea of rising in your life according to your capacity in business and not the class you were born into, as was still very much the British standard of the time, became the underpinning of what we see now as the modern city, the modern way, particularly New York, the kind of archetypal New World city. So let me just go back to where I'm living at the moment, which is Sydney. It's a bit closer to home for me, but another New World city, hardly comparable to New York, but still, if you compare it to Schwäbisch Gmünd, a fairly big place. Now, I currently work there. I'm actually a Melbourne person. And this is the kind of model that Sydney has of itself. It's its brand. You know, it brands itself as the Harbour Bridge, the Opera House, and these are the icons it presents to the world, and how it sees itself and wants others to see it. Now, this is the view from my apartment window, and I'm looking down on one of the biggest workplaces or work sites in the world at the moment, and I'm also listening to it quite a lot, I might tell you. And what you see here when you look out of my lounge room window is what pressure there is on some of the big megacities at the moment. How the natural world that is so celebrated, the harbour, the water, is constantly stressed by continual growth, continual building, and stress for living space, and particularly stress on communication and transport is really stressing that urban-natural blend. And this we see in many cities. You see some of the big mega cities of the New World. And none of the Australian cities can compare in scale and size and stress to some of the world mega cities. Thailand, in fact, is very proud of the fact that it's never been colonised. Of course, it's never been politically colonised. But 20th century internationalism is a stronger, more irresistible force than armies of the past. And although don't like to admit it, they have been very much colonised in many ways. The other thing we need to think of at times is the response of alternative civilizations. In China, the big megacities, such as Shanghai, are continuing to squeeze out what remains of the remnants of Chinese culture-based structure. Recently, I joined a group going to this town called Wushu, and this town is much loved by historians, people who are interested in Chinese culture, Westerners like us who went to visit the city with them. It's not particularly loved by the people who live there. They can't wait to get out and move into a brand new apartment. You know, and so we also have to be a bit careful about sentimentalism in terms of looking at historical and cultural structure from the past. Sentimentalism may not be the answer. People in developing countries don't want to be interactive museum species for tourists. And so there's a stress there about preserving the past when it's often not desirable to the people who are living in the remnants of the past. Another major area, and you know this talk is so typical of talks in that it will leave with more questions than it'll leave you with answers. But it's really important to just think about, touch on these points, that there are so many different ways of understanding city and urban spaces. This is another book I was reading just recently, and it talks about the response of the Middle East to cities. We have much more to do today to touch on some examples of very, very complex issues. In his book, The Crisis of Islamic Civilization, Ali A. Alawi, who's a Princeton researcher but used to be a member of the government in Iraq after the fall of Saddam, writes, about the loss of Islamic civilization to a kind of Western model, but in a sense a very perverse Western model. And he talks about the rampant commercialization, brand worship, gigantism, and class segregation of the Gulf cities as one of his examples. He quotes Mike Davis as terming it a place where Speer meets Disney on the shores of Araby. It's a challenge, he claims, that pits the advantages of embracing globalization, even in this weird form, against a historically determined or traditional form of Islamic civilization. All Muslims can do, he says, with this particular response to globalization, is to package the final product of their civilization in ways which may be culturally or politically acceptable to their own societies, and accept the risk that it might fatally undermine whatever is left of Muslim society. So let me just pop back to our Western society here. And much of what we believe and do and think, of course, relates to the stories we've built about ourselves. Mythology, religion, belief systems, these all underpin how we understand ourselves and what we are. But by the same token, I'll just put a few pieces of some of my work there to make the point that in our domestic environments, we are also developing a kind of mythology, a kind of story about ourselves. So what we do in our own homes and our own places is build around ourselves objects and icons of who we want to be and what we want to be. And we do that in a kind of, sometimes, a form of resistance to design as much as a celebration of it. There is a romance around domestic celebration. We have what we call an aesthetic response, but we're not quite sure what that really means. Designers use the word aesthetic all the time, and what they mean by it is the look of something. And that can be a kind of diminishing idea of what aesthetics actually means conceptually. There's been a lot of work done recently in how our brains make choices. How do we know what we like? How do we know what we want? How's our brain actually making those choices? And design teachers in design schools have been talking for years about good design, bad design, aesthetics, how we manage the choices we make in that. But there's a whole new area in cognitive psychology at the moment in which researchers are trying to work out how do people actually relate to objects. There's some work being done by Eleanor Roche at the moment on categorization. And this work deals with the most elemental of mental functions. And it's starting to unravel how we recognize the objects in the world around us. How we know, for instance, that the thing in front of us is a chair and not a dog, and what kind of chair it is and what kind of dog it is. And to go even further, recently a number of disciplines have come together around a Darwinian model of behavior. And coming from such fields as cognitive neuroscience and genetics, there's a lot of research going on at the moment is how do we organize ourselves and our brains to relate to the world? And in this context, our creative actions, including the structures, designs, cities, places we design, and the method in which we use them, can consequently be seen as extensions of a Darwinian strategy for survival. Our environments and what we design to go in them is an extension of our forefathers on the savannah, who the brain had to work very quickly and say, can I eat this or can it eat me? And I survived if I could make that decision with my brain really quickly, long before I could put language around it, long before I even understood what that could mean. It was about survival. There's a lot of research going on at the moment that how we relate to objects in our environment and how we understand design is actually part of that Darwinian survival response. And if we go down that path, we have to change the whole language of how we talk in design schools about design. And did I go to the... Yeah, thanks. As well as regarding that visual perceptual as a primary domain of human knowledge, we also talk about categorization. How do we categorize things? How do we manage the environment? How do we put things in certain places and say, this is where they belong, or that's where they belong? My colleague, Professor Alan Whitfield, he maintains that a fundamental tenet of this perspective is that categorization is one of the basic functions of life, one of the elemental ways in which we form meaning. Categorization involves grouping objects together as similar and distinguishing them from other objects. And clearly a lot of research has been done about facial recognition around that. And it seems our brains are hardwired, and that builds our notion of what constitutes an attractive face or not an attractive face, something that we'll eat, something that will eat us. So we respond to pattern and system. The drive to create structure is embedded in us. We're not making kind of surface decisions, we think we might, but it's really primal, Darwinian part of our existence, according to this particular stricture. Whitfield maintains that motivation comes from pleasure. There's a pleasure center in the brain, and that this comes from that midbrain emotional center that's activated during the process of creating categories and strategies. And that it's for this reason that children learn. Otherwise, it's suggested, why would they bother to learn? So the picture of a child sitting on the floor sorting toys or building blocks or parts of a puzzle into patterns and categories strikes a familiar chord for us. And we respond with patterns and systems. People like to match things, like to match the curtain with the carpet, or the shirt with the suit, or the toothbrush to the bathroom cabinet. What is it that's happening in our brain that makes us want to match and categorize and create these systems? Because that's all our cities are, they're these sorts of systems. We respond with patterns and systems, but we also respond by looking for things that are not part of the pattern and system. And this touches on that human tendency to classify by the separation of the similar from the different. The search for pattern was only made possible by the complementary process of recognizing things that don't fit the pattern, the things that are different. And if we can identify something that's essentially other, that can be excluded, what is left must belong. So we can jump from that now, from making discretionary decisions about environment to sociology, and perhaps even how we believe we fit with other people and how they fit with us. We've made so many responses over the years to design and what it means to us. One of them is this dogma. Those of us, particularly of my age, who studied industrial design in the 60s, we were pretty much imbued with that idea of design as social good, a social force, and very much the tenets that grew out of the Bauhaus eventually found their way to the Chicago Institute of Design, about design being a way of saving people. Design was going to save everybody. Of course, the opposite was thought to happen as well, too. And there was a connection between the modern design as a social grace, and it kind of leaked over sometimes into a kind of fascism, too, as it did with Italian futurism. So it became the opposite side of that. And we responded with these dogmas, and some of these early films at the time, like the very famous film Metropolis, was investigating that idea of the machinery of modern living and the machinery of modern city, dehumanizing the people who sat within it. Now, let's look at the vernacular response. Most people in the world go home to this. Okay, this is a version that sits within each culture of Gemütlichkeit, familiarity, grandma's place, and it has a certain kind of soporific comfort level. And it makes us think, how do we relate to objects? And what do we as designers, who talk to people about what is supposedly good design or bad design, say to human beings who don't want to listen and who say, no, good design for me is where I'm comfortable, where I feel at home, where I feel I belong. And that's what I call that Vernacular Response. It's a counter movement, actually, and people don't particularly want to listen because they are fitting into a comfort zone, a pattern of what they know. In The Meaning of Things, which is a publication by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and Eugen Rochberg-Halton, they talk about a lifetime of research they do into how people relate to objects. Objects, their environments, their rooms. And they found through much research that if you really research with people the things that they love that are important to them in their lives, they're not just designer objects, they're not great works of art, they are objects that have a crude meaning. The things people would grab and run out of a burning house with, we know are usually photographs, but they are also grandma's old cracked cup, the little bootie that the baby wore. They're items that have a crude meaning for us and become symbols of our past. And they would claim, he did claim after a lifetime of work, that human capacities for creation and redirection of meaning offer the only hope for survival. So he would say, let's stop talking about good design, bad design. Let's start talking about how people relate to their environment and how that works. And so there is a kind of resistance movement. This is a subconscious resistance movement, but there's also a conscious resistance movement. I took this out of the paper. This was a man who built a mountain on top of his apartment in China. A university professor in Beijing, Zhang Lin, had built this mountain on top of his 26-story apartment. Real rocks, fake rocks, earth, trees, fake trees, growing stuff. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, of course, he was forced to start deconstructing it. But what was he doing there? What was going on in his brain? Why was he creating? He was creating some kind of metaphor for what he saw as being perfect existence, relationship to the natural world, and he was just popping it over the top of where he had to live in his apartment. I mean, we all have our own little stories about this, getting back to Gemütlichkeit again. As a migrant child in Germany, say 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, I witnessed German friends of my parents clinging to this idea of Gemütlichkeit. These were people who came from different parts of Germany who wouldn't have ever spoken to each other if they hadn't coalesced as a group of Germanness in another country. And they clung to this as a kind of memory, a soul memory. And even then I understood it to be a life raft in a sea of cultural strangeness and insecurity. They were looking for an anchor into their own past, their own history, what they saw themselves as being. Now later, as an industrial design student, I also shared with all of my friends, derogatory terms such as kitsch. Yep, kitsch. But as I've got older, I've started to realize that's a very ugly, controlling word. Kitsch really means I'm better than you, I'm superior to you, I'm more educated than you, I'm more socially aware than you, you are stupid and you buy these ugly old things and live with them, but of course I'm better than that. So kitsch becomes a control word. So I've tried as I've become older to be a little less subject to the use of these control words and to understand language for what it actually does. It compartmentalizes people. Human beings are, after all, comfortable with what they know. They're comfortable with what they've experienced or inherited, and memory is such an important anchor in a strange and alienating world. On the other hand, we can surrender. We can have recourse to an interior design decorating movement where external agents sell their artificial illusions of themes and totally integrated looks to homeowners who've lost authorship of their own stories. I'm a great believer, and I've written quite a lot about how what we do in our domestic and workspaces is a story about ourselves. We write that story about ourselves, and we anchor it in icons and imagery of things we collect around ourselves. We create our picture. And the idea of getting an interior decorator in who's going to do, Mexican this year and something else the next year causes us to totally disalienate ourselves from our environment. And of course, the other great thing, if you look at the picture of the hotel, is the kind of hotel room phenomenon where those of you who travel know you wake up in a hotel room anywhere in the world and you can't quite remember where you are because every hotel in the room in the world looks like every other hotel room in the world. It might have decent furniture and it might not be ugly. It could be ugly, it might not be ugly by your standards, but what it certainly isn't is located with you in any sense, and you're not located with it in any sense. So, the idea of the collector, the person who builds a nest around him or herself in his environment, in his city, in his town, the idea of the person who says around herself, these are the icons of my life that I'm creating a story with. This is the response to need and knowing, and it's important in this context to understand personal space as a sanctuary. Now, the city is a collection of personal spaces. Public spaces, private spaces, workspaces, living spaces. But there are many, many sanctuaries in that, and people are resisting in that, and people are doing their own thing in that, and people are ignoring that there's any such thing as design as a culture in that. And some people are much more active. This guy, Alex Glasgow, actually lived in Glasgow, believe it or not. He probably took the name from his city, and he was a protest singer. And he regretted the modernisation of Glasgow and the removal from Glasgow of all the gritty, grimy, ugly but familiar aspects of his childhood and his existence. And he wrote this song where he said, "And while you sterilise and standardise to cauterize the ancient city's ills, you'll find the architects and planners have all saved themselves a cottage in the hills." In fact, he escaped to Australia, to Perth, and lived the last years of his life happily there before he died. So what he was saying, whether you believe it or not, and I'm not saying this is right or this is wrong, but what I've become more interested in this stage of my life is that in the end, people will make their own conceptual constructs around where they want to live and how they want to live. And we as designers need to remember that, and need to remember the importance of the relationship between people and the icons of their memory and their lives. Thank you very much.